He feels a deep pit of regret in his stomach as the weight of his past choices comes crashing down on him. Zuberi sits alone in his dimly lit office, staring at the papers scattered across his desk. Outside, the sun sets over Adonka, casting long shadows across the town. The waves crash in the distance, but Zuberi barely hears them. His mind is consumed with the events of the past few days. The confrontation with Ayira at their 20th anniversary, and the revelation of her affair with Kato. But now, in the silence of his office, Zuberi is forced to confront a truth he has long buried. The cracks in his marriage didn't begin with Ayira's affair. They began long before, when he allowed his obsession with having a son to overshadow the love he had for his family. For years, Zuberi had ignored the emotional needs of his wife and daughters, focused solely on the desire to have a boy who would carry on his family name. His two older daughters, Nia and Zola, were bright, talented, and full of promise. But Zuberi had never truly celebrated their achievements. In his mind, they were girls, unable to carry the family name, unable to fulfill the legacy he had dreamed of. And then there was Imani, the daughter he had lost so tragically. The guilt of not mourning her properly weighed heavily on him. Now, Zuberi realizes that his coldness and obsession with the son had driven Ayira away, creating a distance between them that she eventually sought to fill with Kato. He feels a deep pit of regret in his stomach as the weight of his past choices comes crashing down on him. Zuberi's obsession with having a son began long before Imani's tragic accident. From the moment Ayira became pregnant with their third child, Zuberi was convinced that this time it would be a boy. He had already chosen a name, painted the nursery in deep blue, and bought clothes meant for a baby boy. He didn't even consider the possibility that the child could be another girl. Every conversation between Zuberi and Ayira during the pregnancy revolved around the son they would have. Zuberi spoke excitedly about raising a boy who would follow in his footsteps, who would carry on the family business, and who would make him proud. Ayira, on the other hand, remained quiet, sensing the growing distance between them. She feared that Zuberi's expectations were too high, but she didn't say anything, hoping that things would change once the baby was born. When the day of the birth finally came, Zuberi paced the hospital hallways with excitement and anticipation. He could already picture himself holding his newborn son in his arms, introducing him to the world. But when the doctor came out and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Zuberi, you have a healthy baby girl," his world shattered. Zuberi was overcome with disappointment. Without even seeing Ayira or their newborn daughter, he stormed out of the hospital, consumed by his anger. He didn't care about the joy of a new life. All he saw was failure to have a son. As Zuberi walked out of the hospital that day, his heart was pounding with rage. The plans he had made, the dreams he had built for a son, had all been torn apart. He couldn't bear the thought of facing Ayira, couldn't bear to hold another daughter in his arms when all he wanted was a boy. He pushed open the hospital doors and stepped out into the street, ready to leave his family behind in their moment of joy. But just as he was about to walk away, the doctor called after him. "Mr. Zuberi, wait!" Zuberi stopped, turning back with a scowl. "What now?" he snapped, his voice filled with bitterness. The doctor, his expression firm, approached him. "I don't understand your reaction," he said, his voice calm but stern. "You have a healthy daughter, a beautiful child. Why are you so disappointed?" Zuberi clenched his fists, the anger boiling inside him. "Because I wanted a son," he spat. "I've waited for years for a boy, and now, once again, my wife has given me another girl." The doctor's expression darkened, and he shook his head in disbelief. "Mr. Zuberi, do you even understand how a child's gender is determined?" Zuberi frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" The doctor looked him square in the eye. "It's not your wife's fault. The child's gender is determined by the father's chromosomes, not the mother's. The doctor's words hit Zuberi like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled as he tried to process what he had just heard. All these years, he had blamed Ayira for not giving him a son. He had allowed resentment to build in their marriage, making her feel as though she had failed him. But now, standing in front of the hospital, Zuberi realised that it was never Ayira's fault. It was him. Zuberi staggered back, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He had spent years subtly making Ayira feel inadequate, blaming her for something that was beyond her control. And all the while, he had been the one responsible for the gender of their children. The shame was overwhelming, and Zuberi felt his knees grow weak. For a moment, the world seemed to spin around him, and he had to steady himself against the wall of the hospital. The doctor's words echoed in his mind. It's not your wife's fault. The child's gender is determined by the father's chromosomes. Zuberi had spent years longing for a son, building his identity around the idea of having a boy who would carry on his family name. But now, that identity was crumbling, and he didn't know who he was anymore. In the weeks following the birth of their third daughter, the distance between Zuberi and Ayira grew even wider. Zuberi was consumed by shame, but he didn't know how to express it. Instead, he withdrew further from his family, burying himself in his work and avoiding Ayira and the children as much as possible. Ayira, on the other hand, was devastated by Zuberi's reaction. She had hoped that he would come to terms with the birth of their daughter and find joy in their growing family. But instead, he had grown colder and more distant than ever. Ayira was left to care for their daughters on her own, while Zuberi focused all his attention on his business. The grief of losing Imani still weighed heavily on Ayira's heart, but Zuberi had never truly shared in that grief. He hadn't been there for her when she needed him most. The emotional distance between them was unbearable, and Ayira felt more alone than ever. She had lost her husband long before she ever turned to Kato. Ayira didn't set out to betray Zuberi. In the beginning, Kato had simply been a friend, someone who was there to listen when Zuberi wasn't. He had always been a close family friend, someone Ayira trusted. But as the months went by and Zuberi became more and more distant, Ayira found herself turning to Kato more often for comfort. It started with small conversations, talks about the children, about life, about the struggles of marriage. Kato was understanding, always ready to listen, and he made Ayira feel seen in a way that Zuberi hadn't for years. Slowly, those conversations turned into something more. Ayira wasn't looking for love or excitement. She was looking for connection, for someone who would care for her and understand her pain. And Kato was there, offering her the comfort and companionship that she so desperately needed. Ayira knew it was wrong. She knew that she should have tried to fix things with Zuberi, that she should have confronted him about his coldness and the distance between them. But by the time she realised how deep her relationship with Kato had become, it was too late. The night of their 20th wedding anniversary was supposed to be a celebration of their love, a moment to reflect on the life they had built together. But for Zuberi, it was a night filled with anger and betrayal. He had suspected for weeks that something was going on between Ayira and Kato, but he hadn't wanted to believe it. As the evening wore on, Zuberi watched Ayira and Kato from across the room, noticing the way they glanced at each other, the way they stood a little too close. His suspicions turned into certainty, and by the time the dinner toast came around, Zuberi couldn't hold back his anger any longer. Standing at the head of the table, Zuberi lifted his glass, his heart pounding with rage. "To family," he began, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "To the love we share and the bonds we have built." He paused, his eyes locking with Ayira's. She smiled back at him, unaware of the darkness in his gaze. "But tonight," Zuberi continued, his voice growing colder, I have a truth to share. A truth that has been hidden for far too long. The room fell silent as Zuberi's words hung in the air. Ayira's smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion and fear. She glanced at Kato, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't prepared for the storm that was about to hit. Zuberi turned his gaze to Kato, his eyes blazing with fury. "Kato, my oldest friend," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "You have been a brother to me, or so I thought." Kato stiffened, glancing nervously at Ayira. The room grew tense, the air thick with suspense. "But betrayal," Zuberi continued, his voice shaking with anger. "Betrayal cuts deeper than any knife. It leaves scars that never heal." Gasps rippled through the room as Zuberi's words sank in. Amani, Kato's wife, looked at her husband in disbelief, her face twisted with confusion. Kato's face grew pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Zuberi turned back to the guests, his voice cold and unrelenting. "My wife," he said, "the woman I have loved for 20 years, has betrayed me. With my best friend." Ayira's breath caught in her throat as the room erupted into shocked whispers. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she couldn't speak. Zuberi's words had exposed her deepest shame, her biggest regret. She had never wanted it to come to this. But now the truth was out, and there was no going back. Amani's hand flew to her mouth as she stared at Kato, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. "Kato, is this true?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Kato lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. He had no excuses, no way to explain what had happened. All he could do was stand there, ashamed and defeated. Ayira, trembling, stepped forward, her voice barely audible. "Zuberi, please." But Zuberi shook his head, his face twisted with anger and pain. "How could you?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How could you do this to our family?" Ayira fell to her knees, her sobs shaking her entire body. "I was lost," she cried. "I was alone. Please, Zuberi, I love you. Don't tear our family apart." The room was filled with an unbearable tension. Ayira's sobs echoed in the silence, and Zuberi's anger radiated like heat. Their family, their marriage, the life they had built together, it all seemed to be collapsing before their eyes. Zuberi looked down at his wife, who had fallen to her knees, her hands trembling as she begged for forgiveness. He had never seen her like this, so vulnerable, so broken. But the pain and betrayal still coursed through his veins, clouding his judgment. Amani, still in shock from Kato's silence, could no longer hold back her tears. "How could you do this, Kato?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her world had shattered too. Kato, the man she had trusted with her heart, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. Kato finally spoke, his voice low and filled with shame. "Amani, But he couldn't finish the sentence. What could he say to justify the damage he had caused? Zuberi's fist clenched at his sides as he looked at Kato, the man he had once considered his closest friend. He had trusted Kato, confided in him, and now that trust had been ripped apart. "You're no friend of mine," Zuberi spat, his voice trembling with emotion. "You betrayed me. You betrayed all of us." The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room. Zuberi turned away from Ayira, his heart heavy with the realization that their marriage had been broken long before the affair. The collapse of their relationship wasn't just about Ayira's betrayal. It was about years of neglect, silence, and unspoken pain. As the night wore on, the guests slowly began to leave, murmuring their condolences and offering words of comfort. But Zuberi hardly noticed. He was lost in his own thoughts, his mind replaying the events of the past. Moments of joy, moments of pain, and, most of all, moments of regret. He thought of Imani, their youngest daughter, who had died so tragically at the age of 3. Zuberi had never truly grieved her death. To him, Imani had been just another girl, a daughter, not the son he had so desperately wanted. He had distanced himself from Ayira, pushing her away in her time of greatest need. He had been cold, indifferent, and completely blind to her pain. Now, as he stood in the empty room, Zuberi was forced to confront the truth. His obsession with having a son had been the root of their downfall. He had never celebrated his daughters. He had never celebrated his daughters the way a father should. He had never acknowledged their talents, their intelligence, or their worth. And now, as he thought back to the day of Imani's death, the guilt consumed him. Ayira had mourned alone. She had carried the weight of that grief by herself, while Zuberi had buried his emotions, refusing to face the reality of their loss. He had been a distant husband, a distant father, and now he was paying the price. Zuberi felt like he was back in time. Memories came flooding back to him that he was not proud of. Zuberi's anger had shifted. In those days, he found himself dwelling more and more on his disappointment in Ayira for not giving him a son. His daughters, though bright and full of promise, had never satisfied the deep need he felt for a male heir. A son, he believed, would carry on his name, would take over the family business, just as every man in his family had done for generations. When Ayira had announced that she was pregnant once again, Zuberi had clung to this new hope, like a drowning man to a lifeboat. This time, it would be a boy. It had to be. He had told Ayira again and again how important it was for this child to be a son. She had listened quietly, but Zuberi now realised how heavily the pressure must have weighed on her. His obsession had grown. At one point, he had even begun considering taking a second wife, Njeri, a widow from the neighbouring village. Njeri had been kind and gentle, and most importantly, she had understood the importance of having a son. Zuberi had convinced himself that if Ayira couldn't give him what he needed, then Njeri surely would. The day of the birth had finally arrived. Zuberi had waited outside the hospital room, his heart racing with anticipation. He had paced the hallway, his mind filled with images of a strong, healthy boy, his legacy, his pride. When the doctor had emerged, smiling brightly, Zuberi's heart had leaped in his chest. "Congratulations, Mr. Zuberi," the doctor had said. "You have a beautiful, healthy baby girl." In that moment, Zuberi's world had crashed down around him. Another girl. His hope had vanished, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He had forced a smile, but inside, his disappointment had been crushing. The doctor, noticing Zuberi's reaction, had pulled him aside. "Mr. Zuberi," the doctor had said gently, "I feel I must tell you something. The gender of a child is determined by the father, not the mother. It is the man who carries the chromosomes that decide whether the baby is a boy or a girl." The doctor's words had struck Zuberi like a bolt of lightning. All those years he had blamed Ayira, made her feel as though she had failed him. But it had never been her fault. The truth had left Zuberi stunned, his mind racing. He had been wrong about everything. Ayira sat in their bedroom, her face still wet with tears, her heart aching with regret. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. She knew that her affair with Cato had been wrong, but she hadn't been searching for love or passion. She had been searching for connection, for someone to see her, to acknowledge her pain. For years, she had carried the grief of losing Imani on her own. Zuberi had distanced himself from her, focused only on his desire for a son. Ayira had felt invisible, unloved, and completely alone in their marriage. Cato had been there when Zuberi wasn't, and though it had never been about love, it had been enough to fill the void that had grown between her and her husband. Now, As Ayira sat alone, she wondered if there was any chance of repairing the damage that had been done. She had betrayed Zuberi, but she wasn't the only one at fault. Zuberi had pushed her away long before Kato ever entered the picture. He had made her feel like a failure, like she wasn't enough because she hadn't given him a son. But was that enough to justify her actions? Ayira didn't know. All she knew was that their marriage was hanging by a thread, and she didn't know if it could be saved. Zuberi lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. Sleep eluded him as his mind raced with thoughts of the past. His anger toward Ayira had begun to fade, replaced by a deep sense of guilt and regret. He had been so focused on her betrayal that he hadn't taken the time to reflect on his own role in their marriage's collapse. He thought of Nia and Zola, their two older daughters who had been caught in the middle of their parents' emotional rift. Zuberi had never truly appreciated them, always viewing them as second best because they were girls. He had been blinded by his desire for a son, unable to see the gifts his daughters possessed. Nia was brilliant, excelling in school and showing a natural talent for business. Zola was creative, her artwork filling their home with colour and life. But Zuberi had ignored their talents, dismissing their achievements because they didn't fit into his narrow view of what a legacy should be. As he lay in the darkness, Zuberi realised that he had failed not only as a husband, but as a father. He had allowed his obsession with a son to cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had missed out on the joys of raising his daughters. The guilt was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, Zuberi felt the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. The next morning, Zuberi stood outside the door of Ayira's bedroom, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He had spent the night reflecting on his own shortcomings, the ways in which he had failed both his wife and his daughters. He knew that he couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but he also knew that he couldn't continue to live in silence. Taking a deep breath, Zuberi knocked on the door. When Ayira's soft voice called out for him to enter, he hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The air between them was thick with tension, but Zuberi knew that this was a conversation they could no longer avoid. "Ayira," he began, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "We need to talk." Ayira looked up at him, her expression weary but open. "I know," she whispered. "There's so much we haven't said, Zuberi, so much we've ignored." Zuberi nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I've been so focused on having a son that I never saw what I already had. I never saw you, Ayira. I never saw our daughters." Ayira's eyes filled with tears once more, but this time there was something different in her gaze, a flicker of hope. As the conversation unfolded, Zuberi and Ayira began to unpack the years of pain, regret, and unspoken feelings that had built up between them. Zuberi admitted to his coldness, to the way he had distanced himself after Imani's death, and to the hurtful way he had made Ayira feel like she had failed him by not giving him a son. Ayira, in turn, confessed the loneliness she had felt for years, the grief she had carried on her own, and the way she had turned to Kato out of desperation for connection. She didn't excuse her actions, but she wanted Zuberi to understand that she hadn't betrayed him out of spite. It had been the result of a marriage that had slowly fallen apart. As the morning sun streamed through the window, Zuberi and Ayira made a promise to each other, to try to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, to try to reconnect as partners and as parents. It wouldn't be easy, and they both knew that the road to redemption would be long and painful. But for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. Zuberi knew that his relationship with Ayira wouldn't be fixed overnight, but he was willing to put in the work. More importantly, he knew that he needed to mend his relationship with his daughters, who had been neglected and overlooked for far too long. As Zuberi left the room, the weight of the past still lingered, but there was a new sense of purpose in his heart. He had made mistakes, many of them, but now he had a chance to make things right. And for the first time in a long time, Zuberi was ready to face the future. If you've been captivated by the emotional journey of Zuberi and Ayira, don't forget to show your support. Their story of love, loss, and the road to redemption is one that many can relate to, and we want to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings in the comments. Let us know what part moved you the most, and if you're rooting for Zuberi and Ayira's path to healing. Your engagement means the world to us. By liking, commenting, and subscribing, you're not only helping us bring more stories like this to life, but also joining a community of people who appreciate the depth and complexity of human relationships.